This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is one of the podcast's favorites. Back for his third visit, Ben Brown, CEO of VPP provider Renew Home. Ben's going to describe the new agreement between Renew Home, Sunrun, and Tesla to deliver virtual power plants, or VPPs, representing over 16 gigawatts of flexibility for utilities and data centers across the country. Ben began as a consultant to energy companies and in energy and system congestion forecasting, and he's worked in consumer and home automation products for 20 years. He led the Google Labs development of domain-specific applications of large language models and the Google Nest teams on distributed resource solutions, energy and connectivity, integration, and subscriptions, all key VPP elements. He became CEO of Renew Home in 2024. So, Ben, let's just start for a moment with what Renew Home itself does, and we're going to get to the specifics of this new agreement. But first, just give us an overview of the agreement you have with Sunrun and Tesla to provide these 16 gigawatts of CPPs. You're calling it a capacity as a solution framework that directs what you're going to do. And you got to explain that after you explain what Renew Home does and what the agreement's about. Why is capacity as a solution, really important? How does it work?
Well, thank you so much again for having me, Herman. It's always great to be here. So just for a bit of background, for Renew Home, we work with the largest set of households across the country. Really focused early on with our history around working on smart thermostats with the Nest Learning Thermostat team at Google for a long time, as well as other key HVAC and thermostat partners to work with over 8 million devices across the country, 6 million households, over 6 gigawatts of flexible load ready to be delivered to the system. And so for that background, it's important to note around why we did this agreement with Tesla and Sunrun. And so, a huge challenge, I think, for the last 15 plus years when we think about the power that distributed energy resources and flexibility can provide to the system has always been this chicken and egg challenge. Like, if you design a perfect program with the right policy incentives, will you get enough flexible resources to come online to provide something meaningful to the grid as an alternative to just continue to build more generation and infrastructure? Or do you have enough of that already on the grid today that you can now deploy to the system? And the reality is that over the last 15 years, because of smart thermostat adoption, because now the emerging adoption of batteries and solar and EV chargers, you're actually starting to get to the point where there's actually a lot of these DERs already deployed on the system. But right now, the system isn't completely set up to be able to leverage those resources at full scale and provide value back to customers for doing so. And so we wanted to be really public around looking at the three of our collective resource pool, three of the largest providers of VPP solutions in the world, to be able to look at that in aggregate across the entire country, being very specific about the size of the resource. So the idea that we have 16 gigawatts of flexible capacity ready to be delivered to the system tomorrow. That is actually very important, especially given the challenges we're looking at from the supply constraint side that we're seeing today, as well as transmission and distribution system upgrades that need to happen, and all of that being wound up together and driving up costs for everyone. And so we wanted to be public about it, and that was why we kind of were very specific. We laid out both the numbers around it. We actually developed a really cool map visualization to look state by state about how that resource is, the composition of that resource across the country. And so, that's why we did what we did a few weeks ago. We think it's a really powerful signal to the market, to utilities, to regulators, to policymakers, to governors, legislatures, et cetera, to recognize the power of this resource and the need to provide cost relief and rewards to customers as much as possible over the coming years, just given some of the challenges we're seeing in the system.
We're going to get to this, the where and the what you're going to provide in a minute, but I want to go back to this capacity as a solution framework to start with, Ben. What is this is something that you stressed in your announcements, and I think it references to what you just said a few minutes ago, dealing with the problems of today. I mean, you've been working in these home solution issues for a long time, but there's some new problems today because of the load growth that we're seeing for the first time in a couple of decades. And I think that's what you mean as capacity as a solution. You're saying basically that utilities need something called capacity, which is uh, ability to either lower peak demand or add things that can meet peak demand. Am I saying that right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the way the system is built today, it's all built towards dealing with the peak hours of the year, whether those exist during the summer or the winter for summer or winter peaking utilities. And so if you think about those, let's call those dozens of peaking hours that exist across the system, that's where about 20% of overall cost is actually deployed for the generation stack that goes to meet those peaking needs, as well as the transmission and distribution system that has to be able to allocate for the congestion and the load that comes from that. And so if you think about that specific, you're really trying to design this type of resource to be able to meet those peaking needs because that's such a huge driver of ongoing cost for the system. And so capacity as a solution is looking at saying, hey, during these, let's call them 50 to 100 hours of peaking needs throughout the year, you actually have a resource that's multi-threaded. So back to your point between a demand side resource as well as a supply side resource in terms of batteries that can export electrons to the grid, being able to bring these resources together with us, Tesla and Sunrun is really, really helpful to showcase that not only do you have a resource that can meet some of these peaking needs, it exists today. It's not necessarily new devices or hardware or things that need to be interconnected. We just need a mechanism to make sure that customers can get the value associated with these resources that they can provide.
So let's dig into some of the big specifics here. First, I'm curious about the roles that Renew Home, Tesla, Sunrun are going to play. It looks like it's going to be your smart thermostats, Sunrun's rooftop solar and home batteries, and Tesla's EV charging. So make sure I'm right if I'm saying that right. But the main question I have is who's going to control all those technologies? And then the other part of this question is these companies are you have resources all over the country. So how do you know where they're going to be used and how they can wherever they're going to be used? Are they going to help address that growing demand for electricity?
No, it's a great question. So there's a couple components to it. So one is the first focus on this is really around leveraging the huge fleet of smart thermostat and HVAC systems that are connected and enrolled in the Renew platform, and the battery storage systems, Tesla battery storage systems, and the battery storage systems that Sunrun has deployed on behalf of Tesla and others. And so that's kind of the composite of what is going into the analysis of the 16 gigawatts that is ready to be deployed today. And so what's important to note about all of that is that we all, currently have dispatch platforms for being able to coordinate how those are dispatched to the grid as a capacity solution. And so, as part of the agreement, we'll work together to, integrate those dispatch tools so that we can provide, again, a solution that can be optimized and coordinated on behalf of partners that we work with, whether that's a utility, whether that's a hyperscaler, in terms of what the needs of the resource needs to be.
I got to interrupt you, Ben. I know that Sunrun, for one, prides itself on being independent, and I'm sure Tesla does too. And you guys have always been independent and had that remarkable success with smart thermostats and reducing peaks. So you're going to integrate into a central system, or are you going to be working with the energy hubs and the uplights of the country where the utility has those services? It seems like not a impossible thing to control, but a somewhat challenging thing to get all the communications and so on set up right. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward for us because we already have dispatch tools that we use with these partners, specifically utility partners, et cetera. And so does Tesla and Sunrun. So it's not that complicated in terms of a dispatching signal being sent and then us being able to propagate that signal across the fleets. So that itself is actually not, I don't think, the challenge here. The thing that actually gets super interesting that you brought it up, Herman, is actually a bunch of the cool cross optimization that you can have within the fleet, at the fleet level, in terms of leveraging the different characteristics of the resource, which we will work on together, as well as actually even within home. There's a lot of amazing opportunities for when you think about solar and storage and how that is actually coordinated with an HVAC system and HVAC optimization. If you look at places like, that have net metering or time varying rates, where in which exporting electrons to the grid has different value parameters at different points in the day, you can easily imagine a world in which we can do cross optimization of using pre-cooling when it's actually electrons are not valuable to the grid, and then being able to have the house be at temperature and conditioned properly so that when electrons are valuable to export to the grid, then you can maximize the value to that household. So there's a bunch of cool things that we will plan to do as we work on this together that, again, maximize the value to households. Because the most important thing to highlight in all of this is that the benefit of using distributed resources with households across the country is that we can provide value and maximize value back to those households by having them be part of the solution versus having all of us invest in new infrastructure, whether that's new peaking generation and new transmission and distribution that has to be to propagate those electrons, that gets passed through and increased rates for everyone. And so that's why, to me, this is such an important time to talk about kind of the scale of the existing resource and ways in which to maximize value that gets passed through to customers as part of that.
It sounds like one of the things that this agreement will do is expand utilities' awareness of the value of flexibility. So I think that I'd like to get you to tell me a little bit about that. Um, the fact that utilities maybe still really haven't recognized the value. But you guys have demonstrated, all three of these companies have demonstrated that you can provide this flexibility that can protect power system reliability. So my questions as I pour forth these thoughts, number one, do you feel like this agreement is partially going to expand utilities' awareness of what you have to offer? And my other question is, can you tell us a little bit about how you've really demonstrated that this flexibility can protect power systems?
Yeah, so I think at the core of all of this is the first principles of scale is what matters the most in this entire conversation. I think
Mm,
that everyone across the board in the industry, over the last 30 years, has been excited about the idea that having flexibility in demand could be a really useful component to the future of the grid. Like everyone's talked about it, we all want to leverage that as much as possible. The real question for a long time has been, what is the scale of that? And actually, how does that relate to the reliability and firmness of that? And so I think as we move forward, both with the advent of much more precise AI, actually having much larger penetration of folks that have automated types of resources in their home, whether that's a connected thermostat, whether that is high telemetry, high response rate batteries and EV chargers and heat pumps, hot water heaters. These things now actually become much more of a reliable resource than even a centralized power plant. Because you think about centralized generation, that does actually fail, significantly. It happens all the time during significant weather events, maintenance, things like that happen all of the time. And the
absolutely. And
rea and the real and
people
that's
really aren't, people really, people who don't understand clean energy options completely overlooked that. I'm really glad you said that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ben, but I want to stress that natural gas plants don't have more than maybe a 70 or 75% reliability. Coal plants less. Nuclear plants even are offline 5% of the time. So all of these resources that you're providing can pop in there when those things happen, right?
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of the benefits we have with the grid as a whole is the idea of the power of large numbers. And so it's why specifically we prefer a grid that has a diverse set of a generation stack. And it's also, by the way, why now, it's early days. It makes sense why people have been in the past skeptical of how demand side resources can provide something that is valuable and firm and scale. Because early days, when you would have a pilot program where you only have a couple of hundred participants or you have a couple thousand participants, it's hard to see kind of the value of the size of the resource and the diversity of that pool. But now, when we're able to talk about 8 million plus devices, 6 million homes, you can actually leverage. You have hundreds of megawatts available in all the major utilities across the country, with hundreds of thousands or millions of households to be able to use. You get to really embrace the power of diverse large numbers, where in which that actually inherently provides a massive amount of resiliency to be able to leverage. And the fact that it's not just one centralized resource, you have a whole other benefit to this that is about distributed capacity, right? So this whole, the idea of using this notion of DPPs or distributed power plants versus virtual power plants, that has a whole other benefit to the transmission and distribution grid, which we haven't even talked about, but that's a huge part of what is driving cost increases across the system right now, is the fact that we have aging infrastructure and infrastructure that was not built for the level of demand growth that we're seeing.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a minute, but I want to go back. You mentioned that map that you guys released with this agreement. Just briefly, Ben, can you summarize where are you going to be able to provide this capacity as a solution?
Yeah, so there's definitely a few obvious states that are just seeing a tremendous amount of load growth, and therefore a lot of challenges to the system in terms of being able to site and build new capacity, and or some of the challenges we're seeing with cost increases that are being passed through to residential households. And so there's some areas like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois. You're seeing huge amount of resource that we are showing that are available on the sideline. So in Virginia today, we have 300 megawatts that we will be ready to deploy tomorrow. And so growing up to 500 megawatts by 2030. That's a perfect example of that. That's an area where in which there's a lot of great economic development that's happening across the system, whether that's hyperscalers, whether that's onshoring and manufacturing, whether that's electrification of a bunch of resources across the system. And so, but that's not, the only place. I mean, you look through the map, you can see huge areas for opportunity in Florida, in California. Illinois is another great example of that. And you're seeing a lot of places that are also aligning with governors and legislatures, policymakers, and really progressive utilities that are really trying to push to engage this resource as fast as possible. Because they too, I mean, let's just be clear about this. I think utilities and utility executives are really excited about trying to leverage the future of DERs as a way to kind of meet some of the challenge in the system, and to work with other counterparties and stakeholders to kind of push the acceleration of leveraging that resource. And I think that's something that's also getting lost in the mix. Like I think you're seeing most of our utility partners, Renew, we work with about 150 plus utility programs across the country over the last decade. And most of the partners we're talking with are really excited about how they can accelerate and leverage this, broader resource because they see some of the power of scale that we already have.
Okay, so the one more thing that I want to talk about is something called system utilization. We talk about it often on the podcast here, but I'm not going to stop talking about it until we have better system utilization. Um, and the reason I'm not going to stop talking about it is because it has so much impact on affordability. So why don't you go ahead and explain, Ben, um, what system utilization is, why it's important, and why it's important to make electricity more affordable for everybody, whether they own DER or not. Go ahead, Ben. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And so I was hinting at it before, but when you really think about how the system is designed, it's really built for the peaking hours of the year. And those peaking hours represent a really small percentage of the overall time of the overall hours of the calendar year, but they represent a huge amount of cost, right? So if you think about the peaking hours, it's usually about 20% or so of system costs that go towards just meeting these peaking hours. And so that specifically, when you think about utilization, it's calling out the fact that you have essentially 20% of costs that are allocated towards a few hours of the year. And so if you can find ways to shift usage out of those peaking hours, create less of these kind of very severe peaks, you can kind of leverage, especially now in a world where we're growing demand, if you can, flatten out those peaks a bit, you can increase system utilization. And just Brattle Report is a perfect example of this. We think that there's about 100 to 200 billion dollars worth of value of just increasing utilization over the next decade. That's very achievable by leveraging things like VPPs, because very specifically here, we're talking about utilization. It really is around, from a first principle perspective, how do we leverage the resources we already have on the grid to create kind of smoother, kind of more ongoing utilization of the system we have, versus having to invest in net new infrastructure that has to then get passed through as cost to everyone.
And the advantage is that if you use the infrastructure that's there, you don't have to build new infrastructure. And if you don't have to build new infrastructure, then you're not putting money into customers' rates. And that's those customers' rates that own DER and get some benefit from working with Renew Home or Sunrun or Tesla, and also customers who don't own DER. Am I saying that right, Ben?
So I think that's a really important point to make here, which is, our job as Renew is, we see our job is to advocate for the customers on our platform, in our platform, to get as much value out of the system as possible for the contributions they're making to it. And so whether that's through rewards, whether that's through enhanced savings, it's really important that we are advocating to bring that resource and make sure that it is delivering value to the system and that customers are getting rewarded for that value. But what's amazing about what we're talking about here is, because of the scale of the resource we're using here, really the idea is that not only do folks that are directly enrolled in these programs get rewarded and see significant cost savings for it, but you also have folks that are not participating that get benefits in terms of reduced rates on their bills, because the system is leveraging resources that already exist versus having to invest in new ones that are coming onto the grid. And I think that's an important point to talk about, like, why haven't we talked about system utilization in the past as much? The reason we're talking about it today is because demand is growing. Demand had not been growing for the last 30 years. It is growing now. And so when you think about when demand is growing, that means that either you have to find ways to leverage and get more efficiency out of the system you already have to meet that growth in demand, or you have to invest in new resources to be able to meet that growth in demand. Investing in resources costs money. If you can get more efficiency out of the system you have, more utilization of the system you have, you can obviate some of those new investments that have to go. But what's important to note around where the savings are going to come from is the fact that a lot of the new demand that's coming onto the grid is actually base demand. It's 24/7 demand. It's demand that is existing every hour of every day throughout the year. And there's a lot of points in time in the system in which we have more than enough supply, that's cheap supply, to power that demand, right? So really what you need to do here is try to find ways to flatten these peaks to kind of create less volatility. And if you can do that, you bring down system costs for everyone. And I think that's why it's important to talk about here. It's not like this is a new idea. It's just a new idea that presents itself. It's an old idea that presents itself with a new solution right now because of the growth in demand we're seeing.
Okay, that's a good place to leave it. We're out of time. I could talk a long time about VPPs with my guest, Renew Home CEO Ben Brown. I've got to thank you. You've given us some really interesting details on the new 16 gigawatt of VPPs that can be used by utilities and data centers for flexibility, being provided by Renew Home along with Sunrun and Tesla. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.